The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought from May 4 to May 8, 1942, stands as one of the most transformative engagements in the history of naval warfare and a defining moment in the early Pacific campaign of World War II. Although often overshadowed by the dramatic American victory at Midway 1 month later, Coral Sea marked the first major turning point in the struggle between the Allied powers and the Japanese Empire. It was a battle born from months of relentless Japanese expansion, escalating Allied resistance, and the harsh realities of waging a multi-front war across the vast and unforgiving Pacific Basin. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific had become the world's most dynamic battlefield, and the Coral Sea became the stage where two powerful fleets would clash in a contest that rewrote the rules of sea combat and altered the direction of the global conflict. To understand the importance of the battle, one must first consider the strategic situation following the outbreak of the Pacific War. After the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1942, Japan embarked on a rapid and sweeping offensive, capturing territory from China to Burma, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, and across much of the South Pacific. Japan's goal was to establish an impenetrable defensive perimeter, a vast shield of territory and naval power that would secure essential resources, isolate Australia, and force the United States into a negotiated settlement. By early 1942, this plan seemed to be working. The Allies, still reeling from repeated defeats, scrambled to reorganize their remaining forces. Yet even amid the devastation, seeds of resistance were taking root. American aircraft carriers, the only major capital ships not destroyed at Pearl Harbor, became the backbone of a new mobile strategy that prioritized flexibility, long-range aviation, and decisive engagement with Japanese carrier forces. In this evolving strategic landscape, Australia emerged as a vital anchor for Allied operations. Its geographic location made it a critical staging ground for counteroffensives, supply networks, and air operations spanning the Pacific. Recognizing this, Japan developed plans to sever Australia's lifelines and isolate it from American support. The invasion of Port Moresby in southeastern New Guinea became central to this goal. From Port Moresby, Japanese aircraft could threaten northern Australia, while their naval forces could dominate sea lanes stretching from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. The Port Moresby operation, codenamed Operation MO, thus became one of the most ambitious Japanese undertakings of the war. It required a coordinated assault involving the Imperial Navy, land-based aircraft from Rabaul, transport ships carrying invasion troops, and, most importantly, two of Japan's elite fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku. The United States, however, had intercepted Japanese communications through the growing success of code-breaking operations. American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii deciphered enough Japanese signals to deduce that a major operation was underway in the Coral Sea region. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz made a bold decision. He would send two American carriers, USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, along with a task force of cruisers, destroyers, and support ships to intercept the Japanese advance. The decision forced the U.S. Navy into a high-stakes confrontation at a time when it could ill afford losses. Yet it also created an opportunity to halt Japan's southward expansion before it reached Australia's doorstep. What unfolded in the Coral Sea was a type of battle the world had never seen before. For the first time in naval history, opposing warships would fight without ever sighting one another directly. Aircraft, rather than guns, would determine the fate of fleets, and aerial reconnaissance, attack coordination, and carrier-based strike power became the new instruments of naval dominance. This evolution reflected the rapid technological and tactical changes that had taken place in the interwar period and foreshadowed how the Pacific War would be fought thereafter. Coral Sea demonstrated that naval aviation had outgrown its auxiliary role and now commanded the center stage of maritime strategy. The battle's initial phase began with American and Japanese forces searching the vast Pacific for each other, launching scouting flights over hundreds of miles of open water. Misidentifications, weather conditions, and communication delays complicated the task, as both sides struggled to locate the other's carriers before exposing their own. These early engagements culminated in the dramatic sinking of the Japanese light carrier Shoho on May 7th, prompting the now famous radio message from an American pilot, "Scratch 1 flat top." Yet the sinking of Shoho represented only one part of a far larger struggle. The following day, American and Japanese carrier groups launched massive airstrikes against each other, resulting in fierce aerial combat and devastating ship losses. The USS Lexington, one of the U.S. Navy's most important carriers, was fatally damaged and later scuttled. Yorktown suffered significant harm but survived, limping back to Pearl Harbor for rapid repairs. Shokaku was heavily damaged by American dive bombers, while Zuikaku's air group was so depleted that both Japanese carriers would be forced to retreat. In immediate tactical terms, the battle was costly for both navies and inconclusive in its overall score. The Americans lost a precious fleet carrier, hundreds of aircraft, and many skilled airmen. Japan retained tactical control over much of the battle area and inflicted heavy losses on Allied forces. Yet strategically, Coral Sea was an unmistakable Allied victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was called off, marking the first major failure in Japan's Pacific campaign. This single outcome had enormous implications. Australia was secured, Allied morale surged, and the Pacific balance shifted more favorably towards the United States. Furthermore, the absence of Shokaku and Zuikaku from the upcoming Battle of Midway dramatically weakened Japan's carrier strike force, contributing directly to the catastrophic defeat Tokyo would suffer there. Beyond its immediate strategic consequences, the Battle of the Coral Sea left a deep and lasting legacy on naval doctrine, Allied cooperation, and the direction of the Pacific War. It revealed the necessity of integrated air and sea operations, demonstrated the decisive power of coordinated carrier strikes, and underscored the importance of intelligence in shaping military strategy. It also highlighted the fragility of even the most formidable fleets when confronted by air superiority. Lessons learned at Coral Sea informed American tactics at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the broader island-hopping campaign that would eventually push Japan back towards its home islands. The battle also strengthened ties between the United States and Australia in ways that would endure long after the war ended. Australians recognized Coral Sea as a moment when American forces directly protected their nation from invasion, and to this day, the battle remains a cornerstone of U.S.-Australian military and diplomatic relations. Coral Sea commemorations continue yearly in both countries, honoring the sacrifices of sailors and aviators who fought to preserve freedom in the Pacific. Today, historians view the Battle of the Coral Sea not merely as a single engagement, but as a profound turning point in the conduct and trajectory of the Pacific War. It marked the end of unchecked Japanese expansion, introduced a new era of carrier-dominated naval warfare, and set the stage for the pivotal American victory at Midway. More than that, it symbolized the growing determination of the Allied powers to resist aggression and reclaim control of the Pacific. Although the battle was costly, its long-term consequences reshaped the war in ways that ultimately favored the Allies. The roots of the Battle of the Coral Sea stretch deep into the geopolitical upheavals, ambitions, and military calculations that defined the Asia-Pacific theater in the first half of the 20th century. Japan's drive for imperial expansion did not emerge suddenly with the outbreak of the Second World War. Instead, the clash that materialized in May 1942 was the culmination of decades of regional tension, failed diplomacy, industrial competition, and military planning on both sides of the Pacific. The United States and Japan, two rapidly rising powers with competing strategic visions, saw the Pacific Ocean as both a buffer and a lifeline. Control of the sea lanes meant control of resources, communication, food supplies, and global reach. As Japan strengthened its foothold across East Asia and the Western Pacific, the United States found itself forced into a defensive posture, struggling to protect both its interests and its allies against the steady advance of a confident and battle-tested Japanese war machine. By the late 1930s, the convergence of ideology, resource scarcity, and strategic calculus pushed Japan toward an increasingly confrontational path. Having already occupied Manchuria in 1931 and plunged into full-scale war with China in 1937, the Japanese Empire turned its attention toward Southeast Asia. The region's rich oil fields, rubber plantations, tin mines, and strategic ports promised self-sufficiency and military security for a nation that saw itself encircled by Western colonial powers. The United States, for its part, had watched Japan's advances with growing alarm, but restrained itself from direct intervention. Washington issued protests, embargoes, and diplomatic warnings, yet none were sufficient to curb Japan's ambitions. Instead, each sanction convinced Japanese leaders that American influence posed the single greatest barrier to their vision of a self-contained, self-sustaining empire. The outbreak of war in Europe in 1939 shifted the balance of global attention and gave Japan an opening. Britain and France, two of the major colonial powers in Asia, were suddenly consumed by their struggle against Nazi Germany. Japan moved swiftly to exploit the vacuum. When German forces conquered France in 1940, Japan secured permission from the collaborationist Vichy government to station troops in northern Indochina. This foothold placed Japan within striking distance of Southeast Asia's most critical resource zones. At the same time, it heightened Washington's concerns that Japan's aggression was no longer confined to China, but was rapidly expanding into a theater with vital Western interests. By mid-1941, Japan's strategic choices were narrowing. The U.S. oil embargo, initiated in response to Japan's occupation of southern Indochina, threatened the empire's industrial and military capabilities. Japan relied heavily on imported oil, and American supplies accounted for a significant share. Without access to new reserves, Japan estimated it had less than 2 years of operational capacity. Diplomatic negotiations in Washington attempted to resolve the crisis, but both sides approached the talks with incompatible goals. Japan sought recognition of its conquests and a free hand in Asia. The United States demanded withdrawal from China and Indochina. The deadlock made conflict increasingly likely. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched its coordinated offensive across the Pacific, striking Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and other Western strongholds. The goal was clear: neutralize American naval power, secure vital resource zones, and establish a defensive perimeter strong enough to deter any counterattack. Pearl Harbor devastated the U.S. battleship fleet, but it left untouched the aircraft carriers, vessels that would soon define the next phase of the Pacific War. In the months that followed, Japan advanced at breathtaking speed. Singapore fell, the Philippines crumbled, and Japan seized control of the Dutch East Indies, fulfilling its long-sought dream of oil independence. Despite these victories, Japanese planners understood that time was not on their side. The United States possessed immense industrial capacity and would eventually rebuild its Pacific fleet. Japan's only hope was to extend its defense perimeter to a distance that would make American counteroffensives costly and strategically difficult. This plan required control of key islands, ports, and sea routes. Among the most important of these were New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, a chain of territories that, if captured, would isolate Australia and cut off Allied lines of communication. Australia, still reeling from battlefield losses and heavily reliant on American support, was a critical link in the Allied defensive network. Japanese leaders believed that isolating or neutralizing Australia would fundamentally weaken the Allied position in the South Pacific. The road to the Coral Sea was paved by these calculations. Japan's next major objective became the seizure of Port Moresby, a strategic port on the southeastern coast of New Guinea. If successful, the Japanese would gain a forward base from which they could threaten northeastern Australia, disrupt Allied supply routes, and exert pressure across the South Pacific. The operation, designated MO, was conceived as a combined amphibious and naval assault supported by air cover from Japanese carriers. At the same time, Japanese forces planned to occupy Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, securing an advanced reconnaissance and naval outpost. Unbeknownst to Japan, American intelligence specialists had already begun breaking portions of the Japanese naval code. Signals analysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii intercepted and deciphered enough communication to reveal that a major Japanese offensive was imminent in the Coral Sea region. Though details were incomplete, the United States gained a strategic advantage: time to prepare and position its limited but capable carrier forces. USS Lexington, CV-2, and USS Yorktown, CV-5, two of the few carriers available in the Pacific, were dispatched under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Though heavily outnumbered across the wider Pacific, the U.S. Navy recognized that the upcoming confrontation could determine the fate of Australia and the southern Allied defensive perimeter. Both sides approached the coming battle with new realities shaped by the early months of the war. Aircraft carriers had already proven their potential, but the Coral Sea would become the first major naval engagement fought entirely by carrier-based aircraft. The opposing fleets would never sight each other directly. Instead, planes would serve as the eyes, fists, and shield of their respective fleets. This shift represented a revolutionary moment in naval warfare, signaling the end of battleship dominance and the rise of aviation as the decisive force in maritime conflict. As the Japanese fleet assembled, its commanders were confident. The Imperial Japanese Navy had accumulated extensive combat experience and had spent years refining carrier doctrine, aerial coordination, and operational planning. Japanese naval aviation, particularly its skilled pilots, well-designed aircraft, and aggressive tactics, had already demonstrated superiority during the early war months. Yet the Coral Sea operation required precise timing, coordination across multiple task forces, and a degree of risk. Despite the Empire's earlier successes, Japan was stretching its forces across vast distances, and each new operation added strain to its logistics and manpower. The United States, meanwhile, approached the coming confrontation with urgency but not despair. The aircraft carriers represented the heart of America's remaining naval striking power. Though outnumbered and often outperformed in early engagements, U.S. aviators were steadily improving their tactics, communications, and operational efficiency. The Pacific Fleet's leadership understood that stopping the Japanese advance was essential not only for strategic reasons but also for morale. The Coral Sea offered perhaps the first real chance to halt Japan's momentum after a painful string of defeats. In the weeks leading up to the battle, reconnaissance flights, code-breaking, and cautious maneuvering set the stage for the confrontation. The Coral Sea, an expanse of ocean flanked by New Guinea to the west and the Solomon Islands to the east, would become the arena for this unprecedented clash. Its vast distances, unpredictable weather, and scattered islands created a complex environment for carrier warfare. Pilots often struggled to locate enemy ships across hundreds of miles of open water, while commanders contended with incomplete intelligence and the constant threat of surprise attack. What made the Battle of the Coral Sea historically significant was not merely the scale of the forces involved, but the strategic implications of the fight. For Japan, capturing Port Moresby was a stepping stone toward isolating Australia and consolidating dominance in the South Pacific. For the United States and its allies, defending the region was vital to maintaining supply lines, preserving regional influence, and preparing for future counteroffensives. Each side recognized that the stakes extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The outcome could reshape the map of the Pacific and alter the trajectory of the war. As both fleets closed in on their objectives, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any seen before. a duel fought not by battleships at point-blank range, but by pilots, aircraft, and distant carriers relying on skill, courage, and timing. The road to the Coral Sea had been shaped by decades of tension and months of rapid-fire warfare. Now, as the clock ticked toward May 1942, the next chapters of the Pacific War would unfold not in the trenches or on the beaches, but in the skies over a remote expanse of ocean where two great naval powers prepared to test the very future of maritime combat. Japan's decision to initiate Operation MO, the ambitious plan to seize Port Moresby and secure dominance over the southern approaches to Australia, was rooted in a complex web of strategy, geography, and wartime momentum. By early 1942, the Japanese Empire had achieved a string of stunning victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, dismantling Allied defenses from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. Yet with each conquest came new logistical demands and broader frontiers to protect. The empire's strategic planners understood that their hold on these newly acquired territories depended on extending their defensive ring farther into the Pacific. Port Moresby, located on the southeastern coast of New Guinea, represented a linchpin in this grand design. Japanese military leadership recognized that controlling Port Moresby would give them a forward base capable of projecting power directly toward northern Australia. From Port Moresby's airfields, Japanese bombers could strike deep across Australian territory, disrupt shipping routes, and potentially isolate the continent from American reinforcement. For the Allies, the port served as a final bastion, shielding the vulnerable supply lines that connected the United States, Australia, and the South Pacific. Both sides understood the stakes, and both prepared for a campaign that would determine the future of the region. Operation MO was conceived as a multi-pronged offensive involving naval task forces, carrier aviation, air support from land-based units, and amphibious landings. The Japanese command structure divided the operation into several coordinated elements, each with a distinct objective. One force would seize Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, establishing an early warning and reconnaissance base to support the larger offensive. Another would escort the troop transports bound for Port Moresby. A powerful covering force, including the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, would provide the air superiority necessary to protect the invasion fleet and eliminate any Allied naval interference. To execute this operation, the Japanese relied heavily on the skill, speed, and cohesion of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its carrier air groups had proven nearly unstoppable during previous offensives, from the attack on Pearl Harbor to the conquest of the East Indies. Japanese aviators were among the most experienced in the world, training rigorously in long-range navigation, coordinated strike tactics, and precision bombing. Their aircraft, such as the Mitsubishi A6M0, the Aichi D3A Val, and the Nakajima B5N Kate, were exceptionally maneuverable and deadly when used in coordinated waves. The Japanese Navy entered Operation MO confident that these strengths would again secure rapid success. However, the Japanese did not know that U.S. intelligence units had begun deciphering their operational communications. Codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii intercepted and analyzed a steady stream of signals that hinted at an impending offensive aimed at MO, a designation they gradually connected to the Port Moresby region. Although the exact timing and composition of Japanese forces remained unclear, the American Pacific Fleet gained enough insight to anticipate the general outline of the operation. This allowed Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to deploy U.S. carrier forces, USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, to intercept the Japanese advance and disrupt the Port Moresby invasion. As April 1942 gave way to May, Japanese forces began moving into position. Their initial objective was Tulagi, a small but strategically placed island in the southern Solomons. Though not heavily defended, Tulagi offered an ideal location for reconnaissance seaplane bases, which were essential for maintaining situational awareness across the vast expanse of the Coral Sea. Japanese troops landed on Tulagi with little resistance, quickly establishing control and beginning construction of seaplane facilities. But this initial success would soon be challenged by American carrier forces racing toward the region. While the Tulagi landing unfolded, the core of the Japanese invasion force advanced toward New Guinea. The convoy transporting troops for the assault on Port Moresby consisted of multiple transports protected by destroyers and covered from above by land-based aircraft operating from Rabaul and other forward bases. At the same time, the powerful carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Takeo Tagagi, comprising Shokaku and Zuikaku, and their escort vessels moved southward to shield the invasion corridor from Allied interference. These carriers would become the centerpiece of the coming battle. Japan's operational plan hinged on precision and timing. The Tulagi occupation needed to be secured quickly so that seaplane reconnaissance could begin. The invasion transports had to maintain a steady course toward Port Moresby under the protection of carrier aviation. Meanwhile, land-based bombers from Rabaul were expected to suppress any Allied airfields that could threaten the operation. Success depended on the seamless coordination of naval, aerial, and amphibious units across hundreds of miles. The Americans, aware of the Japanese movements but uncertain of their intentions, scrambled to intercept the invasion forces. Admiral Fletcher maneuvered his carriers cautiously, seeking to avoid detection while positioning them to strike decisively once Japanese targets were confirmed. Carrier warfare was still in its infancy, and both sides faced the challenge of locating enemy fleets in the vast and unpredictable expanse of the Coral Sea. Weather patterns, cloud cover, and the sheer distances involved made reconnaissance difficult and often frustrating. Aircraft launched in search of enemy ships often returned without sighting anything, while others misidentified vessels or underestimated their strength. As Japanese ships pressed deeper into the Coral Sea, the risks of the operation grew. The Imperial Japanese Navy was confident but stretched thin. Simultaneous offensives across multiple fronts forced commanders to distribute their forces widely. Although Shokaku and Zuikaku were among the most formidable carriers in the world, their air groups were not fully replenished after months of intense operations. The strain on logistics, maintenance crews, and pilot endurance was becoming apparent. Yet the Japanese leadership pressed forward, believing that swift action would secure Port Moresby before the United States could muster overwhelming resistance. By early May, both sides were poised for confrontation. Japanese reconnaissance patrols searched the sea for signs of American carriers, while American scout planes conducted their own sweeps across the region. Initial skirmishes began as American planes struck the newly occupied Tulagi positions, surprising the Japanese and destroying several seaplanes. Although the attack did not halt the Tulagi operation, it alerted Japanese commanders to the presence of U.S. carriers in the area and increased the urgency of locating and neutralizing them. The middle days of the operation were defined by confusion, missed opportunities, and moments of sudden violence. Both navies launched airstrikes based on incomplete or inaccurate reports, leading to attacks on supply ships, destroyers, and isolated groups rather than the main carrier forces. The Coral Sea's labyrinth of islands, combined with unpredictable weather patterns, sometimes cloaked entire fleets behind fog, rain, or heavy cloud cover. This created a battlefield where success often depended on chance as much as skill. Yet amid this uncertainty, one element remained constant: the Japanese commitment to capturing Port Moresby. The invasion convoy was pushed onward under the belief that the carrier force would soon eliminate the American threat. But the Americans were equally determined to prevent this outcome. Lexington and Yorktown formed the backbone of the Allied response, their air groups preparing for the pivotal strikes that would determine the fate of the campaign. As Operation MO reached its climax, both sides prepared for the carrier duel that would transform the battle. The skirmishes, reconnaissance flights, and early air attacks had set the stage. The Japanese invasion convoy was still on course toward Port Moresby, unaware that the decisive engagement was only hours away. The Japanese carriers, in turn, believed they were closing in on the American fleet, ready to unleash their veteran aviators in a sweeping assault. Meanwhile, U.S. carrier groups tightened their formation and readied their torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters for the engagement that would determine whether the Japanese invasion could proceed. The events that culminated in the sinking of the light carrier Shoho marked one of the most dramatic turning points in the Battle of the Coral Sea and one of the earliest major American naval victories of the Pacific War. The phrase, "scratch one flat top," famously radioed by Lieutenant Commander Robert E. Dixon after the carrier went down, became a symbol of shifting momentum in a conflict that had, until then, been dominated by rapid Japanese expansion. But the destruction of Shoho was not simply a singular moment of triumph. It was the result of a complex interplay of reconnaissance, timing, coordination, and resolve that illustrated both the growing sophistication of American carrier operations and the evolving nature of naval warfare itself. In the hours before the attack, the Coral Sea was a theater of heightened uncertainty, with both Japanese and American forces maneuvering carefully in search of one another. The Japanese, still focused on the Port Moresby invasion, operated under the assumption that their main carrier force, Shokaku and Zokaku, would engage any American opposition before the invasion convoy faced real danger. Shoho, a smaller and less capable light carrier, was assigned to provide limited air cover for the convoy advancing toward New Guinea. Although not designed to withstand a major aerial assault, Shoho was nonetheless a valuable asset, offering reconnaissance and fighter support essential for the amphibious operation ahead. American intelligence, aided by code-breaking efforts, recognized the importance of striking the invasion convoy before it reached its objective. Throughout May 6th and the early hours of May 7th, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft searched the Coral Sea frantically, attempting to distinguish between the multiple Japanese task groups dispersed across the region. Reports were often incomplete or contradictory. Pilots returned with sightings ranging from destroyers to transports, but the elusive Japanese carriers remained hidden behind cloud cover and misdirection. Nevertheless, Admiral Fletcher and his staff understood that preventing the Port Moresby landing required immediate and decisive action. The morning of May 7th brought a breakthrough. American scout bombers spotted a group of Japanese ships that appeared to include significant escort vessels. Although the sighting did not reveal the main Japanese carrier force, it provided the Americans with a credible target. Fletcher ordered a full strike group from both Lexington and Yorktown to attack. The air groups, composed of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter escorts, launched into the skies with the aim of crippling whatever Japanese force they could find. The strike represented a substantial commitment of American aerial power, a gamble designed to disrupt the Japanese offensive even if the main carriers remained elusive. As the American aircraft closed in on the reported positions, the pilots soon realized they were not facing Japan's premier carriers, but instead the light carrier Shoho and her escorting cruisers and destroyers. Shoho, though outmatched, was positioned bravely between the American strike groups and the vulnerable transports she was meant to protect. Her air group was small and already stretched thin from the demands of reconnaissance operations earlier that morning. When the American attack wave descended upon her, Shoho's defenders found themselves confronted with a massive, coordinated assault unlike anything they had yet faced in the war. The attack unfolded with brutal efficiency. Dive bombers from Yorktown and Lexington plunged through the clouds in near-perfect formation, releasing bombs that tore into the carrier's flight deck and ignited widespread fires. Torpedo bombers launched their payloads from both sides, creating a deadly pincer that left Shoho with little room to maneuver. The carrier attempted evasive action, but her speed and size severely limited her ability to outrun the precision American attack patterns. Within minutes, she had been struck repeatedly, her decks engulfed in flames, and her aircraft unable to launch or contribute to her defense. Smoke billowed across the ocean as the American squadrons circled, observing the results of their attack and preparing for follow-up strikes if necessary. Shoho, mortally wounded, listed heavily to one side before sinking beneath the Coral Sea, taking many of her crew with her. The loss of the carrier was a sudden and devastating blow to the Japanese operation. It removed the primary source of air cover for the invasion convoy and forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their timeline and strategy. The sinking of Shoho also confirmed that American carriers were not only present in the region, but capable of mounting effective assaults despite earlier challenges in reconnaissance and positioning. Lieutenant Commander Dixon's now famous radio message, "Scratch one flat top," served not only as confirmation of Shoho's destruction, but also as a symbolic shift in morale for the U.S. Navy. After months of Japanese victories, this moment represented tangible proof that American carrier aviation could match and even surpass Japanese capabilities under the right circumstances. The success bolstered the confidence of American commanders and aircrews, demonstrating that coordinated, well-executed strikes could achieve decisive results against even the most skilled adversaries. Yet, the sinking of Shoho, triumphant as it was, did not resolve the greater battle playing out across the Coral Sea. The main Japanese carriers were still unaccounted for, and the invasion convoy remained a threat. Fletcher and his staff understood that more intense combat lay ahead. The Japanese, for their part, were now aware of the presence of American carriers and prepared to unleash their full carrier striking power. Vice Admiral Tagagi's carrier force began maneuvering aggressively, determined to locate and eliminate the American ships responsible for the attack on Shoho. The Japanese response in the aftermath of Shoho's sinking was swift and resolute. Aircraft from Shokaku and Zokaku launched extensive search missions, scanning the Pacific for signs of the American carriers. Though their reconnaissance was hampered by weather conditions and scattered cloud formations, the urgency of locating the enemy became paramount. The destruction of Shoho meant the invasion convoy now lacked adequate air cover, making the carrier's role even more critical. Japanese commanders concluded that unless the American carriers were neutralized, the Port Moresby invasion would be exposed to overwhelming risk. The Americans, meanwhile, regrouped after the successful attack and prepared for the inevitable counterstrike. While morale was improved, the challenges ahead remained formidable. The American carriers were limited in number, and every aircraft lost represented a significant dent in their combat strength. Furthermore, the Japanese carrier air groups, though not yet encountered in full force, were among the most experienced naval aviators in the world. As both sides maneuvered in the sprawling expanse of the Coral Sea, the sinking of Shoho served as a prelude to the far more intense and consequential carrier duel that would soon to follow. The dramatic destruction of the light carrier underscored the increasing dominance of air power at sea and set the stage for one of the most pivotal confrontations in naval history. The sinking of Shoho marked a dramatic shift in the Battle of the Coral Sea. But the destruction of the light carrier was only the beginning of the far greater clash that now loomed between the primary carrier forces of the United States and Japan. With Shoho gone, both sides turned their full attention to locating and eliminating the enemy's main striking arms, Lexington and Yorktown on the American side, and Shokaku and Zuikaku on the Japanese. What followed on May 8, 1942, was one of the most intense, complex, and consequential carrier duels of the Second World War. It was the first time in history that aircraft carriers fought one another with their ships never coming into direct visual contact, relying entirely on aircraft to locate and destroy their opponent. The duel marked the evolution of naval warfare into an era defined by long-range air power, coordination, reconnaissance, and timing. In the immediate aftermath of Shoho's sinking, both navies recognized the critical importance of striking first. In carrier warfare, the fleet that located the enemy earliest held a decisive advantage. The Coral Sea, vast and unpredictable, challenged reconnaissance squadrons with its shifting cloud cover, scattered storms, and immense oceanic distances. To find the enemy within this environment required skill, luck, and relentless persistence. Through the night of May 7th and into the early hours of May 8th, both carrier groups maneuvered deliberately, attempting to maintain stealth while sending scout aircraft on wide, sweeping arcs across the sea. As dawn broke on May 8th, reconnaissance aircraft from both sides were already airborne. American SBD Dauntless scouts fanned out from Lexington and Yorktown, searching for the Japanese carriers believed to be operating somewhere to the northeast. At the same time, Japanese search planes from Shokaku and Zuikaku scoured the waters to the southwest, determined to identify the American carriers responsible for the attack on Shoho. The first hours of daylight were a tense, quiet race, a strategic duel fought not with bombs or torpedoes, but with charts, radios, and sharp eyes scanning endless horizons. The crucial sighting came shortly after 0800 hours, when a U.S. scout plane reported the position of the Japanese carriers. Within minutes, Fletcher and the American Task Force command staff confirmed the sighting and initiated the launch sequence for a full-scale strike. American pilots rushed to their aircraft, engines roared to life, and the flight decks of both Lexington and Yorktown burst into coordinated activity. The carriers launched a powerful strike group composed of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter escorts, all directed toward the reported position of Shokaku and Zuikaku. Every minute counted. The Americans knew that if they hesitated, the Japanese would inevitably find them and strike first with devastating force. Meanwhile, nearly simultaneously, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft located the American carriers. The Japanese response was swift and highly disciplined. Shokaku and Zuikaku launched their own strike groups composed of experienced air crews who had trained rigorously for precisely this type of duel. The Japanese aviators, many of whom had participated in operations at Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, or earlier Pacific battles, represented some of the most seasoned naval airmen in the world. Their coordinated launch mirrored that of the Americans, and within minutes a formidable Japanese strike wave was airborne, racing toward Lexington and Yorktown. This near-simultaneous detection created a rare and dramatic scenario. Both sides were launching full strike packages at nearly the same time, setting the stage for a double-edged exchange in which each fleet would endure heavy blows, even as it attempted to deliver its own. The fate of both American and Japanese carriers now depended on the skill of their pilots, the resilience of their ships, and the effectiveness of their defensive fighter screens. As the American strike group approached the Japanese carriers, the pilots encountered worsening weather conditions. Low cloud cover obscured visibility, forcing the pilots to navigate carefully as they descended through scattered openings in the clouds. When the formation finally broke through, they spotted Shokaku maneuvering aggressively into the wind, her flight deck busy with aircraft recovering or launching. Zuikaku, shielded by thick cloud formations, remained unseen, a frustrating and strategically significant reality that would shape the day's outcomes. The American attack on Shokaku was executed with determination and precision. Dive bombers plunged from the sky in steep, terrifying dives, releasing bombs that screamed toward the carrier's deck. Torpedo bombers approached from multiple angles, attempting to trap the Japanese carrier in a deadly crossfire of incoming torpedoes. Shokaku's crew responded with fierce anti-aircraft fire, while her pilots, already airborne, tried desperately to intercept the incoming attackers. Yet despite these defensive efforts, Shokaku was struck repeatedly. The bombs tore into her flight deck, sending flames and debris skyward, while torpedo explosions shook her hull. Within minutes, the proud carrier was heavily damaged, her flight deck torn apart, her hangars burning, and her operational capacity severely compromised. Although not sunk, Shokaku was effectively removed from the battle. Zuikaku, hidden by weather, escaped damage entirely. Her survival would have implications in the battles to come, including the decisive Battle of Midway. But for the moment, the Americans had succeeded in disabling half of Japan's carrier striking power in the Coral Sea. While the American attack battered Shokaku, the Japanese strike group was closing in on the American carriers. Lexington and Yorktown prepared for battle, launching fighters to intercept the incoming wave and readying their anti-aircraft gunners for what would become one of the fiercest aerial assaults of the war to that point. The Japanese attack was coordinated and relentless. Dive bombers targeted the carrier's decks, while torpedo bombers approached low and fast, weaving through flak and fighters to launch their torpedoes at vulnerable angles. Yorktown was first to be hit. A bomb penetrated her decks, causing damage but not crippling her. Fires broke out, but her crew responded with discipline and efficiency, containing the destruction and maintaining the ship's operational status. Yorktown's robust damage control teams, who would later play a crucial role at Midway, proved their skill as they restored systems and prepared for continued action. Lexington, however, suffered more severely. The Japanese attack struck her with multiple torpedoes and bombs, causing catastrophic damage deep within the ship. Though initially able to maintain power and speed, Lexington's internal systems were compromised. Gasoline vapors leaked through the ship, creating pockets of explosive fumes. Hours after the attack, secondary explosions ripped through the carrier, igniting massive fires that overwhelmed the damage control crews. Despite heroic efforts, Lexington, affectionately known as Lady Lex, could not be saved. By late afternoon, the order was given to abandon ship. Crews evacuated with sorrow, leaving behind a vessel that had served them faithfully through the early months of the war. Shortly after, explosive charges were detonated to scuttle the ship, ensuring she did not fall into enemy hands. The loss of Lexington was a profound blow to the U.S. Navy. She was one of the few carriers available in the Pacific at the time, and her destruction meant a significant reduction in American offensive strength during a critical phase of the war. Yet the Japanese losses were equally consequential. Shokaku was severely damaged, and her air group had suffered heavy casualties. Zuikaku's air group, though intact, had lost many experienced pilots in the attacks on the American carriers. The result was a paradox. Tactically, the Japanese had inflicted greater immediate damage, sinking Lexington and damaging Yorktown, but strategically, the Americans had achieved their primary objective. The Port Moresby invasion had been halted. Without adequate carrier cover, the Japanese could not continue the operation. The duel between the carriers thus ended in a situation where both sides suffered, but only one side failed to achieve its operational goals. The Battle of the Coral Sea left the Pacific Ocean transformed. Although neither side achieved an overwhelming tactical victory, the confrontation marked a turning point in the naval war between Japan and the Allies. In the immediate wake of the battle, both navies struggled to assess the implications of the unprecedented clash. Ships were lost, aircraft were spent, and crews were exhausted, yet the strategic consequences would reverberate far beyond the waters in which the conflict had unfolded. As the smoke cleared, American commanders recognized that they had stopped Japan's advance toward Port Moresby, preventing the isolation of Australia and preserving vital supply and communication lines in the South Pacific. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, a major Japanese offensive had been halted. This shift provided a critical psychological boost to both American forces and the civilian population, who had endured months of successive Japanese victories across the Pacific. Coral Sea proved that the Allied navies could stand up to the Japanese fleet and blunt its advances even when outmatched in certain areas. Japan, on the other hand, confronted a more complex post-battle reality. While Tokyo claimed victory, based on the damage inflicted on the U.S. carrier force, particularly the loss of the USS Lexington, their strategic objectives had not been achieved. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered damage that would restrict its capacity for future operations. Shokaku, heavily battered, required extensive repairs, while Zuikaku's air group was severely depleted. As a result, neither carrier would be available for the imminent Midway operation, a development that would dramatically weaken Japan's striking power during the decisive battle that followed only a month later. The immediate aftermath also highlighted the transformative nature of carrier warfare. Coral Sea was the first major battle in history in which opposing ships never sighted one another, and the results underscored the growing importance of air superiority. American naval strategists began rethinking carrier deployment strategies, enhancing coordination between scouting aircraft, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. The lessons learned led to improved doctrine that would later contribute to U.S. successes throughout 1942 and 1943. For the Japanese, the battle revealed the limits of rapid expansion and the vulnerabilities inherent in their operational planning. Coral Sea exposed weaknesses in reconnaissance patterns, inter-service communication, and assumptions about American response capabilities. The loss of Shokaku and the temporary removal of Shokaku and Zuikaku from frontline action reduced the cohesion of Japan's carrier divisions, diminishing the qualitative edge they had enjoyed since the start of the Pacific War. Strategically, Coral Sea created the conditions necessary for the pivotal American victory at Midway. Deprived of two fleet carriers, the Japanese attack force at Midway was significantly weaker than originally planned, limiting the number of available aircraft and the flexibility of Kido Butai. Many historians argue that Japan's failure to seize Port Moresby and the consequent inability to secure a southern defensive perimeter also intensified the pressures that compelled expansion into the Central Pacific, culminating in a disastrous overextension. The legacy of the battle would extend even further. Coral Sea became a symbol of resilience and cooperation between the United States and Australia. The successful defense against Japan's southward thrust ensured that Australia could continue functioning as a major Allied base of operations. The battle deepened Allied solidarity in the Pacific, strengthening joint command structures and logistical coordination. In military history, Coral Sea occupies a unique place as the battle that reshaped naval warfare. It demonstrated conclusively that carriers, not battleships, were now the dominant force at sea. The battle served as a proving ground for tactics, strategies, and technologies that would define the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The sacrifices of the crews who fought there helped lay the foundation for future Allied victories and contributed significantly to the eventual defeat of Japan. Ultimately, the Battle of the Coral Sea stands as a testament to the shifting tides of war, the evolution of naval strategy, and the determination of nations fighting for control of the Pacific. Its impact, both immediate and long-lasting, secured its status as a key moment in World War II's maritime history.